give me a little bit more context about the importance of transparency in construction and how that might have changed in the last few years?
Yeah, definitely. So in my theater talk, I talked about every project's an island. And in many ways, that's true. They're like their own little mini businesses. LLCs get set up on the owner side to actually run the job. You have your own team, you have your own books, you have your own client. Oftentimes, you just operate, geographically isolated, and you have some reporting up to corporate, but not a ton. But what I talked about in my theater talk is that that's a little bit of a shame, because then you're sort of limited to each individual's lived experience, which is necessarily finite.
Yep.
And if you don't have great data collection practices, a great way to look back, extract learnings, drive continuous improvement, then all of that experience is just kind of lost. And it's doing a disservice to the young people coming into the industry right now, because who wants to, just work for another 20 years before you get like this much knowledge, right? Isn't there a way to accelerate it? So I think that's what's made data transparency hard in the past. The fact that data was hard to get out of systems, but then the jobs were like geographically isolated and, sort of their own thing. I think that's changed with technology. I think now it's, with the advent of platforms, much easier to get your information out. There's a lot more technology becoming available. And now if you can extract, transform, structure, and then even analyze the data and serve it up in a way where folks can consume it at the point of need or to support a decision or to take an action, now all of a sudden you're unleashing the power of that transparency for the sake of our people. And I think that's really exciting.
I'm curious to hear your opinion on this too, because I'm starting to hear more contractors talk about standardization on a more organizational level instead of that project to project that you're talking about right now. And that challenge is making sure that everybody understands the expectations for how they're either entering or capturing data. And when you do set that baseline and it's similar across projects, now you can start finally looking at that organizational level in a way you might not have had the opportunity before, because you do have that apples to apples comparison. Is that starting to become more common in the ecosystem, or are we still trying to just dip our toes there?
It's a great question. I think it's starting to become more common, and it's a necessary and an inevitable result of that transparency. So the first thing that happens when you have transparency is then people question the data. They're like, is that right? Is that not right? Is it painting the right picture? And then all of a sudden they start paying attention. You start asking questions. You're like, hey, how did that data point come about? Like, exactly how did you measure it? What's the transformation? What's the source? When was it refreshed? All that kind of good stuff. And that then leads people to realize, hey, our processes are not the same. There is a lot of variance across. Now, I do think one needs to be careful with standardization. All the jobs are different. A lot of processes are different. Different people have different preferences. And, to some extent, as long as you get to the right outcome, one shouldn't over control, right? You need to give the job sufficient flexibility to meet the conditions on the ground.
True.
Having said that, then it does need to be a baseline, to your point. And so I think charting out where that baseline is, making sure your data hooks into that baseline so that everybody understands what it's saying and there's no misinterpretation, that's really important.
And how does that play into the culture at the company that you're working for right now, as far as communicating the value and the importance of that? Like, what drove the mindset change within your org in the culture that made people understand the value of some of these things or jump in a little bit more deeply?
Yeah, another great question. I think everybody at the end of the day has to see what the bottom line is for them personally.
Absolutely.
What is the value?
Yep.
Yeah, and it can take lots of different forms. It can take the form of, hey, it saved me time because I didn't have to type up a report that I had to type up every day for the last 2 years, right? That's value. It could be in the form of hey, I can now communicate with my owner in a very fact-based manner, or my trade partners, or my architect, my engineer. And so, it's easier for me to convince them to take an action, take a decision, solve my pain point, because I have the facts to, back up my viewpoint. One of the most surprising things that came out, actually, when we gave that transparency is that, we gave a lot of young professionals the ability to see the high level and to go from a macro view to a micro view relatively quickly without digging through a lot of systems and digging for the right data. And what that gave them is in a way, career acceleration, right? So those that can and those that learn how to read and use and manage with the data, all of a sudden they can be having a very senior conversation. They can be they can come across much more polished than the years might necessarily suggest. And I think when folks see that benefit to them, they will adopt. it takes a little bit of time, takes a bit of a leap of faith to try it that first time. But once they see the value delivered back to them individually, that's when the change happens.